8:30 in the morning. The sunlight cut across the hotel room. But for Dan and Jacob, the day began with a sharp, immediate spike of adrenaline. The mission from the night before hung in the air like static. They did not speak. They did not need to. A single glance between them confirmed the shared, unspoken question. Were they still safe? They moved toward the door of the adjacent room, their footsteps muffled by the carpet. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a gunshot. He pushed the door open, just an inch, then wider. The room was dim, the curtains drawn tight against the morning glare. They scanned the beds, their breathing shallow and jagged. Then, they saw them. Sarah and Simon were there, motionless under the blankets. The sight hit them with the force of a physical blow, draining the tension from their shoulders. They were alive. They were breathing. At 10 o'clock, the silence of the room broke. Simon stirred, his eyes snapping open with a clarity that seemed at odds with the morning light. He looked at Sarah, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. Sarah blinked, shaking off the remnants of sleep, and returned the grin. The tension of the previous night seemed to evaporate in the face of simple human hunger. Simon's stomach gave a sharp, audible rumble, and he laughed. Sarah reached for the phone, placing a room service order with practiced efficiency. Moments later, a sharp knock at the door signaled the arrival of the staff. They wheeled in a cart laden with food, the steam rising in swirls against the cool air of the suite. Simon and Sarah moved toward the table, their eyes tracing the spread as if it were a feast from another world. They tipped the steward and dove into the meal. 10 minutes later, another knock echoed through the suite. This time, it was the rest of the family. Lily rushed in, a whirlwind of energy, pulling Simon into a tight embrace. The room filled with the sound of plates clattering, warm greetings, and the sudden, jarring normalcy of a family breakfast, effectively masking the shadows that still lingered. The laughter faded as Jacob set his coffee cup down with a sharp click against the table. He leaned forward, his gaze locked on Sarah. So, what happened? And why are we all here in Washington? The room grew heavy. Sarah stood, moving to the center of the space, her hands clasped tightly. She took a long, steadying breath. "This is top secret," she began, her voice low and precise. She spoke for several minutes, detailing the events of the previous night, while carefully navigating the boundaries of what she could reveal. As she spoke, the room seemed to shrink. The family sat frozen, their breakfast forgotten. Dan's hand hovered midair, his expression shifting from curiosity to a profound, hollow disbelief. Lily stopped moving, her eyes wide as she processed the impossible nature of the account. It was as if the walls of the hotel suite had dissolved. When Sarah finally stopped, the silence that followed was absolute. No one moved, no one spoke. They looked at each other, then back at Sarah. The heavy air in the suite remained, thick with the echoes of Sarah's words. Dan finally broke the stillness, his voice raspy as he asked about their future in Washington. Sarah shrugged, her uncertainty mirroring the confusion etched onto every face in the room. The usual noise and motion of the family had vanished, replaced by a tense, watchful quiet. Eric, who had been the loudest among them only moments before, sat motionless. He did not pace. He did not joke. His gaze remained fixed on Simon, who sat quietly near the window. The boisterous energy that usually defined Eric had completely drained away, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost reverent. He reached out, his hand coming to rest firmly on Simon's shoulder. Instead, his eyes held a deep, quiet awe, as if he were seeing his little brother for the first time. The silence in the suite was absolute, until the telephone on the side table erupted with a sharp, piercing ring. Every head in the room snapped toward the sound. Dan, sitting closest to the receiver, reached out and picked it up. His voice was cautious as he answered. A brief, one-sided conversation followed, his expressions shifting from polite interest to a tight-lipped frown. He listened for a moment, then held the phone out toward Sarah. "It is Agent Walker," he said, his tone flat. Sarah took the receiver, her fingers gripping the plastic tightly. "Good morning, Agent Walker," she said, her voice steady despite the sudden tension. The room went still again as she listened to the voice on the other end. Her brow furrowed, a deep line appearing between her eyes. A program? What kind of program? She paused, her gaze drifting toward Simon, who sat unaware of the shift in the room. "At noon? I see." She hung up the phone and looked at the expectant faces of her family. The air in the room had changed. "They have a schedule for Simon," she announced, her voice barely above a whisper. "They are coming to pick us up at noon." The room erupted. Jacob stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "They cannot just demand his time like this," he said, his voice sharp with frustration. "You are all exhausted. They have to let you rest." He paced the small space, his hands gesturing toward the door as if to bar it against the outside world. Dan joined him, his face tight with concern. "I agree," Dan added, stepping toward Sarah. "They are building too much on Simon. They treat him like a machine, but he is a small child. He needs a playground, a school, a normal life, not a government schedule." The practical, measured tone of the family had vanished, replaced by a desperate need to shield the boy from the weight of the state. David's mother interjected, her voice cutting through the rising volume. "I do not think they care about our opinions," she said, her tone heavy with the reality of their situation. Sarah sighed, the sound lost in the ongoing protest. She looked at her father, her expression softening as she tried to bridge the gap between his fear and their reality. "Let us see what today brings," she said, raising a hand to quiet the room. "I promise I will ask the pertinent questions." The room fell into a strained, heavy silence. Dan stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the street below, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. Sarah walked over to him, placing a hand on his arm to draw his attention. "Dad," she said, her voice low and steady. "I know what they are doing. I see the weight they are placing on his shoulders." She looked towards Simon, who was busy gathering his things. "I promise you, I will ask the pertinent questions today. I will not let them treat him like a tool without a fight." Dan turned, his eyes searching hers for a flicker of certainty. He nodded once, a brief, sharp movement that acknowledged the reality they were both trapped in. The rest of the family began to gather their belongings, the air thick with unspoken fears. They filed out of the room, their footsteps echoing in the hallway. Sarah stood in the center of the room, the sudden quiet pressing in on her. She turned to Simon, who was waiting by the door. The time for speculation was over. The time for action had arrived. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and prepared to face whatever the government had waiting. A sharp, rhythmic knock echoed against the door, cutting through the silence of the room. She moved to the adjacent room and knocked, her hand lingering on the wood for a moment. Lily opened the door, her face lighting up at the sight of her mother. "Mommy, you are all dressed," Lily said, stepping into the hallway. "Can I go with you?" Sarah knelt, bringing herself to eye level with her daughter. She placed her hands on Lily's shoulders. "Only Simon and I are going," Sarah explained, her voice tight. "You will stay here with Eric and your grandparents." "Hi." Sarah pulled her into a brief, firm embrace, then stood up, forcing herself to turn away. She took Simon's hand. Simon emerged from the room, his movements precise and deliberate. He stood perfectly still, his shoulders squared and his chin held at an angle that suggested a maturity far beyond his years. Sarah watched him, a flicker of unease crossing her face as she realized the boy standing before her was not the child she had tucked into bed only hours before. He projected an aura of absolute readiness, his gaze steady and unblinking as he scanned the hallway. Agent Walker stepped forward, his professional mask slipping for a fraction of a second as he took in the boy's demeanor. "How are you this morning, Simon?" the agent asked, his voice losing its usual clipped edge. Simon met his eyes without hesitation. "I am prepared, Agent Walker." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of what was to come. Simon did not fidget, nor did he look toward the exit with impatience. Sarah reached out to take his hand, but he was already moving toward the elevator. his stride rhythmic and purposeful. The hotel lobby was quiet, the air thick with the scent of floor wax and stale coffee. They walked in a tight formation, Agent Walker leading the way with a hand hovering near his side. Outside, the black Cadillac waited at the curb, its engine idling with a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the pavement. The driver held the rear door open, a silent sentinel in the morning light. Sarah stepped into the vehicle, the leather seats cool and firm against her skin. Simon followed, sliding into the center with a fluid, practiced grace that seemed entirely out of place for a child. Agent Walker climbed into the front passenger seat, the heavy door thudding shut with a finality that echoed in the small space. The interior was dim, the windows tinted to obscure the world outside. As the car pulled away from the curb, the city blurred into a smear of gray and concrete. No music played. No one spoke. The silence inside the car was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against them. Sarah leaned forward, her voice cutting through the mechanical hum of the engine. "Agent Walker, where are we going? What is this for?" "We are headed to the Library of Congress," she stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "It has been closed to the public for a private summit." He paused, letting the weight of the location sink into the small space. "The greatest minds in the country have gathered there. Scientists from every discipline, medicine, nuclear physics, mathematics, and theology are waiting." Sarah felt the air in the car grow thin. "What will they do to him?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "They will evaluate the extent of his knowledge," Walker replied. Sarah looked at Simon. The car turned a corner, the massive stone facade of the library rising into view. They were no longer just passengers. Sarah stared at the passing city, her mind racing to process the implications. "Why him?" she asked, her voice steadying despite the tremor in her hands. He tapped the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the road. "We are currently navigating a diplomatic nightmare. The Canadian Secret Service is demanding answers we cannot provide. They are convinced a weapon was deployed, but there is no weapon on Earth that matches the signature of what occurred." Sarah felt a cold knot tighten in her chest. "And what are you telling them?" she pressed. Walker offered a thin, humorless smile. "We tell them nothing. We deny, we deflect, and we let them chase shadows. The world is not ready to understand the mechanics of what your son can do." He glanced at Simon, who remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Mr. Fleming and Mr. Tanner have staked their reputations on this summit. They need to quantify the unquantifiable." The car slowed as they approached the perimeter of the library. Walker leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, final tone. "This is not just an assessment, Sarah. It is the protection of a secret that could reshape the global balance of power." The Cadillac glided to a halt before the towering stone structure. A large, printed sign hung over the main entrance, claiming the library was closed for maintenance. Yet the perimeter told a different story. Armed guards stood at every point of entry, their eyes scanning the street with mechanical precision. Sarah stepped out, the cool air of the city hitting her as she looked up at the massive, imposing facade. Agent Walker led them toward the Great Hall, where the atmosphere shifted from public space to a fortified bunker. A heavy desk blocked the path, manned by two men in dark suits who flanked three security officers. Metal detectors hummed with a low, constant frequency, the only sound in the cavernous space. Walker produced his badge, his movements practiced and efficient. The men in suits exchanged a silent nod, their attention shifting briefly to Simon before they signaled the guards to clear the way. They were handed 3 passes, the plastic cards feeling cold and heavy in Sarah's palm. As they stepped through the detectors, the weight of the security measures became undeniable. They were no longer in a library. They were inside a controlled environment designed to contain a force the world could not comprehend. The doors behind them sealed shut, cutting off the last remnants of the outside world. They moved forward into the heart of the building, the sound of their own footsteps echoing against the marble floors. The grand hallway stretched ahead, a cavernous expanse of stone and shadow that seemed to swallow their presence. Every turn revealed more of the structure, yet the space remained devoid of ordinary life. There were no tourists, no researchers, only the cold, polished surfaces of a monument that had been repurposed for a singular, hidden objective. As they navigated the labyrinthine corridors, the atmosphere began to change. A low, rhythmic hum of voices drifted from somewhere ahead, vibrating through the air like a distant storm. It was not a single conversation, but a dense, layered murmur of dozens of people speaking at once. Sarah paused, her hand hovering near her side, as the sound grew in intensity. It was the sound of anticipation, a collective focus that felt heavy and suffocating. Agent Walker did not slow his pace, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. He knew what waited behind the walls. The murmurs became sharper. They reached the end of the corridor, where a set of heavy double doors stood as the final barrier. A small plaque identified the space as a projection room, but the sound leaking through the frame suggested something far more significant. The murmur from the other side had sharpened into a rhythmic, low-frequency hum of hundreds of voices, a collective pressure that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Sarah stopped, her breath hitching in her throat. She felt the sudden, sharp reality of the situation, the weight of the unknown pressing against her chest like a physical force. She looked down at her hands, then at the boy standing beside her, realizing that the life they had known was already a distant memory. The air in the hallway felt thin, charged with a static intensity that made the skin on her arms prickle. Agent Walker placed a hand on the door handle, his expression unreadable. The heavy doors swung inward, revealing a tiered space packed with bodies. The transition was instantaneous. The roar of conversation, which had been a constant, vibrating pressure in the hallway, died the moment they crossed the threshold. It did not fade. It was severed. 130 people sat in the dim light, their faces turned toward the entrance with a singular, predatory intensity. Scientists, professors, and engineers sat in rows that stretched upward into the shadows, but their focus was not on the adults. Every eye in the room locked onto the boy. The silence was absolute, heavy enough to feel against the skin. It was a vacuum of sound where even the act of breathing felt like a disruption. Sarah stepped forward, her boots clicking against the floor, and the sound was amplified by the stillness. She felt the weight of those collective gazes, a physical pressure that seemed to pin them in place at the doorway. No one moved, no one whispered. The air in the room was stagnant, thick with the expectation of something impossible. They were no longer in a library. They were in the center of a target, all waiting for a single movement. The boy stood perfectly still, his presence the only thing anchoring the room. Simon did not hesitate. As the silence deepened, he stepped forward, his pace rhythmic and steady against the polished floor. He ignored the rows of observers, his gaze fixed on the lower level where the two men waited. Sarah followed, but she felt like a ghost in the wake of his movement. The boy moved with a fluidity that defied his age, navigating the aisle as if he were walking through his own living room. Every head in the theater tracked his progress, a sea of eyes following his path. He reached the center, where the two directors stood, and stopped. He did not look for guidance or reassurance. Instead, he extended a hand to each of them in turn, his movements precise and deliberate. The directors leaned in, their expressions shifting from professional curiosity to something akin to genuine respect as they shook his hand. Simon turned then, facing the massive assembly. He was no longer just a subject of study, but the focal point of the entire room, waiting for the first word to be spoken. Fleming stepped forward, his movement breaking the tension that had held the room in a vice. He raised his hands, palms toward the assembly, and his voice carried clearly through the space. He spoke with the weight of authority, his words measured and precise. He gestured toward the boy, standing at the center of the stage. The assembly responded instantly. A wave of sound erupted, a sudden, thunderous applause that filled the theater. Sarah sat in the third row, her hands gripped tightly in her lap. She watched the scene unfold, her pulse quickening with every clap. The pride she felt was sharp, but it was shadowed by a cold, creeping dread that settled in her chest. She saw her son standing there, completely unmoved. By the volume, his expression unreadable. He looked toward the microphone, his movements calm and deliberate. The applause began to taper off. Simon brought the microphone to his lips, his movement fluid and practiced. He did not look at the directors or the audience for cues. He spoke, and his voice carried a resonance that seemed to fill every corner of the theater. "Hi, everyone. My name is Simon David Hirsch." The room went cold. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs in a sharp, involuntary gasp. She gripped the armrests of her seat, her knuckles turning white. The name hung in the air, a jarring intrusion that defied the logic of the boy standing before them. Around her, the assembly shifted. Scientists leaned forward, their pens hovering over notebooks, their expressions hardening into masks of intense scrutiny. Simon did not notice the ripple of shock. He continued, his tone steady and devoid of hesitation. "I am 8 years old and was born in Chicago, Illinois. I lost my father before I was born. He was murdered." He spoke of the tragedy with a clinical detachment that made the room feel smaller. Sarah watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the boy she raised, yet the person speaking was someone else entirely. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the weight of what had just been spoken. No one moved. Fleming cleared his throat, his eyes darting toward the assembly as he gestured for the proceedings to continue. A man in his 50s stood up in the front row, his movements stiff and deliberate. He held a small notepad, but he did not look at it. He looked directly at the boy. "Hi, Simon," the man began, his voice steady despite the tension. "I read that you were born dead and that you were revived." Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She watched her son, waiting for a child's confusion, but none came. Simon turned his head toward the speaker, his expression unblinking. He took a breath, and the sound was amplified by the microphone. "Well, I remember everything," Simon replied. "I remember the day I was murdered and all the happenings since then." The boy stood at the center of the stage, his posture rigid and his gaze fixed on the back wall of the theater. "My soul incorporated into my dead son's body," he stated, the words cutting through the room like a blade. He did not blink. He continued to explain the mechanics of his return, his voice devoid of any childish inflection. "I remember my stay in heaven for so many months. The moment they found out that the baby had no soul, I was projected like a laser beam into my own lifeless son's body." A collective gasp rippled through the rows of chairs, followed by a silence so absolute it felt physical. Scientists who had spent their lives studying the tangible world sat frozen, their pens dropped or forgotten in their hands. The air in the room grew heavy, saturated with the impossibility of what they had just heard. Sarah felt her pulse thrumming in her ears, her eyes locked on the small figure. The entire assembly seemed to be holding its breath, caught in the wake of a truth that defied every law of physics they had come to defend. The silence held, a heavy blanket over the rows of experts. Then, a woman in the second row rose. She did not look at her colleagues. Her eyes were fixed on the boy. "What is heaven, or paradise, like?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper in the vast room. Simon shifted his weight, his hands resting lightly on the microphone stand. He did not hesitate. "Paradise is the optimum of a soul's trek," he began, his tone clinical, yet strangely evocative. "The purpose of our various reincarnations is to complete the cycle of cleansing our souls." He paused, letting the words settle. "Understanding that the soul is positive energy in this material world and in paradise, the final destination is to incorporate into the endless light of the Creator, God Almighty." A ripple of movement passed through the crowd as pens finally began to scratch against paper. Simon's gaze swept across the room, unblinking. "Not so in hell, where the soul turns to negative energy," he added, his voice dropping an octave. "We will probably discuss that later." Simon did not pause. He leaned into the microphone, his voice steady and rhythmic. I remember leaving this world through a tunnel of light. But before that, during the first 7 days of my demise, I hovered between worlds. He looked toward the front row, his expression unreadable. I could see and hear everything going on at my house and in the cemetery. I could see, hear, and feel my family's pain and sorrow. A sharp intake of breath sounded from the back of the room. He continued, his tone matter-of-fact. And at the cemetery, I met many souls waiting for the beings of light, what we call angels. Then I was to take the first gate to my right, and that is what I did. The room erupted in sudden, thunderous applause. The applause died away, but the tension in the room only sharpened. Simon remained standing, his posture unchanged as the echoes of the crowd vanished into the high, vaulted ceiling. He waited for the next question, but the assembly seemed paralyzed by his previous account. He took the initiative, his voice cutting through the stillness. "My entire life played back to me like a movie," he said, his eyes scanning the rows of silent, attentive faces. There was nothing I could hide from those beings. At that moment, "You are an open book." He paused, letting the weight of the statement sink into the minds of the scientists and doctors before him. "Every thought, every hidden motive, every secret you have ever kept, it is all laid bare before the divine instructors." A man in the front row leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of his seat until his knuckles turned white. Simon's expression remained calm, almost detached. "You cannot lie to the light. You cannot conceal your nature. When the soul stands before the beings of light, the truth is not just spoken. It is the only thing that exists." The room was so quiet that the hum of the ventilation system sounded like a roar. No one moved. No one dared to break the spell. Simon shifted his weight, his eyes finding Sarah in the third row before returning to the assembly. "You speak of nervous breakdowns and psychological trauma," he said, his voice steady. "But what you call a breakdown, I call a bridge." He recounted the days following his death, when his presence lingered in the family home. "My family was drowning in sorrow, yet Lily was the only one who could hear me." He paused, letting the implications settle over the room. While the doctors were diagnosing her with a collapse of the mind, she was actually holding a conversation with my soul. She did not see a ghost. She saw her brother. He looked at the scientists, his expression challenging their clinical definitions. She was the only one whose spirit was open enough to perceive the frequency I was vibrating on. Her pain was not a symptom of illness, but a reaction to the barrier between our worlds thinning. The room remained frozen. Simon stood motionless, waiting for the next question, his connection to his sister now an established, undeniable fact. Simon turned his gaze toward the back of the room, as if looking through the walls at a destination only he could see. "The tunnel was not a path to be walked," he explained, his voice rhythmic and calm. "It was a descent into an intensity that stripped away everything material. You go down until the light from the end. The endless light becomes so brilliant, it is physically unbearable." He paused, the silence in the room deepening. "That is when you know you have reached the threshold," he described the moment of decision. "I was instructed to take the first gate to my right, and I did." "Ha!" As he spoke, the air in the room seemed to thin. The gate opened into a space that defied all human measurement. It was paradise at my level of purity. There was no noise, no friction, no struggle, only a profound, absolute peace that filled every corner of my being. He looked back at the assembly, his eyes clear. I joined other souls there, all vibrating at that same frequency of stillness. The scientists sat motionless, their pens hovering over notebooks, their questions forgotten in the wake of his description. The room felt suspended. The silence in the projection room deepened until it felt heavy, pressing against the walls. For the first time, the assembly of the greatest minds in the country did not look like experts. They looked like children hearing a story they could not comprehend. A lead physicist in the front row slowly lowered his tablet, his hand trembling slightly. He did not look at his notes. He looked at Simon, Across the room, a renowned neurologist sat with her mouth slightly parted, her pen having slipped from her fingers to the floor. Forgotten. The logic that had governed their careers, the laws of thermodynamics, the boundaries of biology, the certainty of death had been dismantled in a few sentences. They were not just listening to a child. They were witnessing the impossible. Fleming and Tanner exchanged a brief, sharp glance, their own composure strained. No one moved to ask the next question. The list of speakers, once a rigid guide for the conference, had become meaningless. Sarah sat in the third row, her hands resting quietly in her lap. She watched the faces of the most powerful thinkers in the world and saw the exact moment their certainty dissolved. They were no longer looking for data or proof. He stood at the center of the room, calm and anchored, as if he were simply discussing the weather rather than the architecture of the afterlife. They were the first steps on a long, winding road that would never lead back to the quiet life they once held. The fear that had gripped her earlier began to fade, replaced by a cold, clear understanding. This was their new world. Simon was the key, and she was the witness to a transformation that would ripple far beyond these walls. She took a steadying breath, feeling the weight of the future. When the boy finally spoke, the sound that emerged from his mouth sent a ripple of visible shock through the front rows. It was not the voice of a child. It was the voice of David. The resonance of it, deep and unmistakably familiar to those who knew the truth, filled every corner of the auditorium. Yet, the wisdom pouring forth was something entirely new. Something that defied the logic of every brilliant mind gathered there. The only sound remaining in the vast space was the collective, rhythmic breathing of hundreds of people caught in a moment of pure, unadulterated awe. No one dared to shift in their chairs. The collective gaze of the world's most brilliant minds remained locked on the boy, their expressions caught between disbelief and a dawning, terrifying realization. Then, the spell began to fray at the edges. She cleared her throat, but the sound was thin, barely audible. She took a breath, steadied her trembling frame, and looked directly at Simon. "How many gates or levels of paradise are there?" she asked, her eyes searching the boy's face for a sign of hesitation. "And where exactly is paradise?" Simon did not pause to gather his thoughts. His response came with the fluid precision of a master architect describing a blueprint. And each of those 10 levels is further subdivided into 10 more, extending infinitely. A murmur rippled through the hall, a sound of frantic scribbling. Simon continued, his gaze steady. When a person is born, their soul possesses a unique level or degree of purity of positive energy. Upon their departure from our material world, this inherent level of purity acts as a compass, determining which specific level of paradise that soul will ascend to. He leaned forward, his small frame projecting an authority that silenced the room once more. As for where heaven resides, if the universe were to be envisioned as a human body, paradise would be its brain. The scientists sat frozen, their faces etched with a mix of confusion and profound fascination. They were trying to map a new reality. Naturally, there is a minimum threshold of positive energy a departing soul must possess to be reincarnated as a human being, he stated. The room grew colder, the earlier fascination replaced by a palpable, nervous tension. He held up 4 fingers, ticking them off one by one. Souls can be reincarnated into 4 distinct types of existence: humans, animals, plants, and even the inanimate, such as stone, dust, minerals, and other earthly materials. A pen dropped in the back of the hall, the clatter sharp and jarring against the sudden stillness. Simon continued, his voice devoid of judgment, as if he were reciting a simple chemical equation. Just as the 4 dimensions are subdivided, each of these types of existence also contains numerous levels within them. A thunderous round of applause shattered the heavy silence, echoing off the high ceiling. Cameras whirred and flashed, capturing the moment as the audience surged with renewed, frantic energy. An older gentleman with a shock of white hair stood, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his glasses. "Do you happen to know the true size of the universe?" he asked, his voice thin against the lingering roar of the crowd. Simon waited for the room to settle, his gaze sweeping the rows of expectant faces. "To truly grasp the immense scale of the universe, let us continue to employ the metaphor of the human body," he began. "If the universe is a human body, then our galaxy, the Milky Way, is but a single atom within that body. Our sun is a proton, and the planets are the neutrons, and all the other particles contained within that atom. The electrons, or leptons, in this analogy, would be the stars, which function as gluons, binding our galaxy together." He gestured toward the ceiling, his small hand tracing an invisible arc. "With this framework, calculating the actual size of the universe becomes far less complicated." The room fell into a stunned, breathless quiet. A woman stood, her question building on the previous topic. Staying on the same subject, she began, "What surrounds the universe?" Simon's gaze swept across the expectant faces before him, his expression unreadable. "What surrounds the universe," he explained, "is the endless light, or the very essence of the Creator, pure intelligent energy." He paused, letting the words hang in the stagnant air of the hall. "His essence permeates everything. Nothing can come into being without his essence." He raised a hand, gesturing as if holding an invisible, delicate object. "A new galaxy, for instance, cannot form without that energy. It would be akin to a baby born without a soul, stillborn. Both the baby and the galaxy require a derivation of the Creator's essence. The baby needs a soul, and the galaxy needs that fundamental energy. In a profound sense, the birth of a baby is analogous to the coming into existence of a galaxy." The scientists shifted in their seats, the sound of fabric rubbing against wood echoing loudly. They looked at one another, their faces marked by a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. The boundary between the biological and the cosmic had been erased, leaving them to contemplate a universe that was not merely matter, but a living, breathing extension of a singular, intelligent source. A woman stood, her question cutting through the lingering silence. Staying on the same subject, she began, "What exactly are black holes?" Simon's gaze swept across the expectant faces before him. "For you all to comprehend black holes," he continued, "I will persist in using the body as a simple comparison. It is sufficient to explore the human body to better understand our complex universe." He held up a hand, fingers splayed to emphasize the point. "Black holes are, in essence, the digestive apparatus of the universe." The room went deathly quiet, the sound of a distant air vent suddenly audible. "Anything that passes through them does not vanish," he clarified, his voice calm and precise. "It merely transitions to a different dimension, much as our stomachs convert food into positive or negative energies that are then transferred to our bloodstream and subsequently to the necessary parts of our bodies." He paused, letting the implications settle. The scientists sat frozen, their pens hovering over notebooks, struggling to reconcile the violent reputation of black holes with this new model. Fleming rose from his chair, his movement drawing every eye in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice cutting through the intellectual fervor, "let's take a well-deserved break and have lunch. I am certain that everyone is hungry, especially Simon. We will reconvene here in precisely 1 hour." The tension in the hall broke as the assembly began to stir. Sarah, Simon, Fleming, Walker, and Tanner exited the hall together, moving toward a nearby restaurant. Once seated, Tanner turned his attention to Simon, his expression marked by genuine shock. "Simon," he began, "not many people can impress me, but you, without a doubt, have. This is the very first time anyone has ever returned to life and shared with us everything the world has ever yearned to know about what transpires after death." Fleming nodded, leaning forward to emphasize his point. "I wholeheartedly concur. You have rendered the greatest minds speechless. You are, without question, our most invaluable asset." Simon remained composed, his reaction neutral, but the weight of these words struck Sarah with force. She watched the organizers, a surge of pride rising. They finished their meal in relative quiet, the gravity of the morning's revelations lingering between them as they prepared to return to the conference. The conference hall was no longer the silent, orderly space it had been that morning. Even before the organizers returned, the room was buzzing with a frantic, discordant energy. Small groups of scientists had formed near the back rows and along the walls, their voices rising and falling in sharp, jagged bursts of debate. Some stood with their arms crossed, staring intently at their own notes as if searching for a flaw in the logic they had recorded. Others paced the aisles, gesturing wildly as they argued over the implications of a four-dimensional paradise. The air felt heavy, charged with the friction of brilliant minds struggling to dismantle their own life's work. Old hierarchies seemed to dissolve in the face of the new, unsettling reality Simon had presented. A physicist tapped his pen against a table with rhythmic, nervous intensity, while a biologist nearby shook his head, his face etched with a mix of frustration and profound confusion. The fundamental convictions that had anchored their careers for decades were being discarded in real time, replaced by a terrifying, expansive uncertainty. As Simon and the organizers approached the front, the groups did not immediately disperse, their heated exchanges continuing until the very last second. Tanner's voice boomed across the hall, cutting through the lingering debates. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will recommence in 5 minutes. Please take your seats." The effect was immediate. The scattered groups of scientists broke apart, moving with hurried purpose toward their chairs. Within moments, a profound, heavy silence settled over the room, replacing the earlier roar of intellectual friction. As Simon walked toward the podium, the entire assembly rose as one, a spontaneous standing ovation rippling through the rows. The applause was rhythmic and intense, a physical manifestation of their collective need for more answers. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a new weight, sharper and more direct. "I perceive that you now have even more questions than before," he began. "I presented these answers in a simplified manner, not as a sign of disrespect, but so that we would have sufficient time to address all your inquiries." Fleming gestured toward the audience. "Let us resume the questions. You have spoken extensively about heaven," he stated, his voice echoing in the quiet hall. "But what about hell? What is it like, and where is it located?" The air in the room seemed to thin. Simon's expression hardened, his features tightening into a grim mask. He lowered his gaze, his shoulders slumping slightly, and when he spoke, his voice was stripped of its earlier, lighter cadence. It was somber, heavy, with a cold finality. "Oh, hell," he began. "It is, and always will be, the primary source of our problems. Greed, lust, and selfishness are the very forces that allow hell to exist." He paused, letting the words hang in the stagnant air. "Hell is, in fact, an earthly location only." The audience sat motionless. Pens hovered over notebooks, forgotten. Simon looked up, his eyes scanning the room as he continued. "When we are born, our souls arrive with a specific degree of purity. Think of it as a point system. A new soul starts with a positive value, perhaps 1,250 points. Throughout each reincarnation, you either gain or lose those points." He paused, his voice steady. "To return as a human, you need at least 1,000 points. To be an animal, 500. Even a plant requires some positive energy. But if you accumulate negative points, you are reincarnated as a mineral. This is the only level from which there is no return." He leaned forward, his hands resting on the podium. "For such an individual, the body becomes everything. The essence remains with the physical form until the ground absorbs it. It takes thousands of years, but eventually, that body transforms into fuel. The essence then flows toward the magma at the Earth's core. As the saying goes, this person burns in hell. You must understand, the negative energy that constituted this individual retains full awareness of their situation. Time and distance are merely human notions. And for them, this process is an eternal, conscious state. He stopped, letting the chilling reality of his words settle over the hall. The scientists sat frozen, their pens motionless against their notebooks, the air thick with the weight of the revelation. The silence in the hall was not merely an absence of sound. It was a physical weight. Every person in the room remained motionless, their eyes fixed on the podium, yet their gazes seemed to pass through Simon, lost in the implications of what they had just heard. A few scientists gripped their pens so tightly their knuckles turned white, while others simply stared at their notebooks, the pages filled with notes that now felt like relics of a dead era. The fundamental conviction that death was an end, or a transition to a peaceful void, had been dismantled. They were no longer the masters of their own intellectual domain. When a ripple of applause finally started, it was thin and hesitant, lacking the rhythmic, thunderous energy that had defined the earlier sessions. It died out almost as quickly as it had begun, leaving the room in a hollow, uncomfortable stillness. They looked at one another, but no one spoke. The air felt heavy, as if the oxygen itself had been replaced by a lingering, cold dread. Fleming watched the room, his jaw set, observing the visible collapse of their collective composure. The scientists had arrived as seekers of truth, but they were now retreating into a defensive, stunned silence, forced to confront the reality that their entire understanding of existence had been fundamentally, and perhaps irrevocably, shattered. A young woman rose, her eyes searching Simon's face. What climatic dangers must we face in the coming decades? Is the damage reversible? Just as a human body requires rest, the Earth needs its 7th-year cycle to re-energize. We have ignored this. We treat the planet like a battery that never needs to recharge, and it is failing. He gestured toward the room, his voice cutting through the heavy air. We are on a trajectory toward total self-destruction within 50 to 100 years. If the global community does not execute a complete reversal of its current path, civilization will cease to exist. We will regress to the Stone Age, and within a millennium, the human race will vanish entirely. Simon's words acted like a physical weight, pressing down on the assembly. The silence that followed was not one of confusion, but of absolute, paralyzing dread. Simon did not pause to let the dread settle. When I speak of negativity, I mean the inevitable. Humans will instigate a nuclear war that triggers a devastating domino effect. A tiny fraction of the world's population will be the architects of this nuclear holocaust. He scanned the room, his gaze locking onto the faces of the most powerful minds. The world turns a blind eye. People believe they are immune, that the fire will not reach their doorstep. They are wrong. He pointed a finger toward the center of the hall, his voice rising with a sharp, cutting intensity. This war is not a distant possibility. It is the logical conclusion of the path we have chosen. They exploit the global dependency on resources to hold nations hostage, effectively purchasing the silence of those who should be acting. The scientists shifted in their seats, the sound of fabric against wood echoing like gunfire. Some leaned forward, their hands trembling, while others recoiled as if physically struck. The horror was no longer theoretical. It was a countdown, and for the first time, they understood that their own inaction was the fuel for the coming fire. Simon turned his focus to the source of the decay. This fuel, in itself, is a destroyer. It represents the most negative energy, originating from hell, embodying the black essence of souls with poor intelligent energy. He paced the small stage, his movements sharp. This energy is constantly being released, poisoning our atmosphere and the ozone layer. While fossil fuels undeniably aided our evolution, we have become addicted. Over decades, we failed to discover alternative energies, and now, this fuel is a drug to the world's economy. He stopped, his gaze piercing. This infernal poison and our dependency on it are now governing the world. Hell is, in essence, ruling the world. The room went deathly quiet. The scientists sat frozen, the weight of his words sinking in. They had built their entire civilization on this foundation, And now, they were forced to see it as a toxic tether to the abyss. Faces that had been curious were now pale, etched with profound sadness and the dawning realization of their own complicity. Simon lowered his voice, the intensity of his tone grounding the room in a cold, physical reality. Beyond the contamination of our air, we are committing a deeper, irreversible error. We are starving the Earth's core. Every extraction of energy means we cease to feed the magma that sustains our planet's internal fire. He gestured to the floor beneath them as if the ground itself were already turning brittle. In a few decades, that magma will cool and die. The Earth will lose its internal heat, and with it, the stability of its gravity. It will shift out of its place in the solar system, drifting away from the sun into the dark, empty reaches of space. He paused, letting the image of a wandering, dead rock take hold. Once this occurs, life will become non-existent. The oceans will freeze solid. The atmosphere will dissipate into the void. The world will become a silent, frozen tomb, drifting through an endless, lightless expanse. He looked at the scientists, his eyes unblinking. This is not a metaphor. It is the physical trajectory of a planet that has been drained of its fundamental life force. When the gravity fails, the world ends. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the weight of a dying future. The air grew heavy, thick with the weight of a future that no longer held a place for them or those they loved. Fleming, Tanner, and Walker sat motionless, their eyes fixed on the floor, their expressions etched with a profound, hollow sadness. The intellectual fervor that had fueled the morning had evaporated, replaced by the cold, biting reality of a dying world. They were no longer scientists debating theories. They were parents and grandparents staring into a void. Every person in the hall felt the same crushing realization. The knowledge they had sought had arrived, but it was a burden they were not prepared to carry. They looked at one another, seeing the same mirror of despair, the same crushing grief for the generations that would never know a world beyond the coming darkness. A young scientist stood, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. He ignored the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the room. "How certain are you of these statements?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Is there a solution to halt this process? Everything I have described will occur with 100% certainty if the world continues under the current regime." He paused, his expression hardening. "But the answer to your second question is yes. There is a way to change the trajectory." He leaned forward, his presence commanding the entire hall. The silence that returned was no longer the silence of a funeral, but the silence of a held breath. The finality of the end had been challenged.